So a few months ago I made a video where I took a Seagate 8TB archive drive out of its USB case and installed it in a Drobo. If you saw that video, you'll see that at first glance it seemed to work okay and everything seemed to be fine. And indeed, given that my use of that Drobo is fairly occasional, I don't slam it particularly hard or don't normally use it for long periods at a time, that's the way that it might have stayed. But I guess time educates us all, and it turns out that archive drives, in the end, aren't a particularly good choice for a NAS array. And there are a few reasons for that, which I'll explain, but let me talk a little bit about where the problem started. My Drobo had a 4TB drive, a 6TB RAID, and a couple of 5TB Seagate drives in there, alongside the 8TB archive drive. And I'd been, on this occasion, copying to the Drobo for about a week solid, backing up data from somewhere else. Now that translated into a fairly long and unusual amount of uptime. The unit had been powered on and writing to the drives on and off for about a week, and it was at about that point that the Drobo decided that two of the Seagate 5TB drives in the array had failed. I've made a whole other video about that, which chronicles the non-stop fail, mostly on my side, it must be said, in more detail. But obviously, in a drive failure scenario like that, the Drobo starts to kick in its data protection features, which means that it starts moving data away from the affected drives and over to the other drives in the array, which are still good. That sounds quite sensible, but of course what it means is that suddenly there's an awful lot of data being moved around, and those existing good drives are suddenly start to see a whole lot more read and write activity. For a drive that's already on the edge, that could be the thing that tips them over, and that might explain why after about 2 weeks of continuous uptime, with at first infrequent and then some sustained write activity, Drobo then took the view that the Seagate 8TB archive drive itself had failed. It does seem to be the case that Drobo is quite choosy about drives, and when it says that a drive has failed, that doesn't necessarily mean that the drive has become physically inoperable. It's more the case that merely the performance of the drive has fallen below a level which the Drobo considers acceptable. You could have a drive which was perfectly mechanically sound and has never lost as much as a byte of data, but if that drive were to be really slow in responding to Drobo on a number of occasions, Drobo will start to treat that as a sign that the drive is going bad. It may not be really bad, but it does indicate that perhaps the drive isn't as suitable for Drobo as might have been thought to begin with, which is really what leads us to this story and the post-mortem of exactly why you shouldn't use these Seagate drives in a NAS array. The main reason is that, as far as the Drobo is concerned, these drives are a bit slower than the average. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the drives are bad, but it does impair performance, and every time that the Drobo spends more time looking at its watch than it does with getting on with its everyday business, it starts to count that up. And eventually, too much late attendance causes the drive to get fired from the array, so to speak. Once Drobo considers a drive to be bad, you can't just take it out and slap it back in again later on, because it remembers and it just won't have it. So I guess that's the question: why are these drives slow? Well, part of the clue is in the name. Seagate call these the archive drives for a reason, because they're engineered and made really for long-term storage. That means just a few initial writes to fill up the drive with data, and then primarily read operations on the drive to read the data back, but crucially not changing that data very often. You could almost consider it as a bit like a writable CD. You really only write it a few times, and then after that it's almost all reads. Obviously, nothing says that you can't use these drives for sustained random read and write activities, and obviously that will work, but the performance won't be great, and the more you do it, the more likely you are to run into trouble. Now, why is that? Well, that's the second question, and that relates to the technology that Seagate have used to actually bring out a massive 8TB drive at what must be said is still a very reasonable price. There are some very interesting articles on Storage Review which explain the process behind these drives. Now, the archive drives are able to pack more data into the same space because they use a technology called shingled magnetic recording. And SMR makes use of the fact that in most hard drives the read head doesn't need to be quite as big as the write head. So if you say the write head is the size of your middle finger but your read head is the size of your little finger, there's not much difference, but there is some. And normal drives just use their great big thick write heads to write big tracks on the disk, and the little read heads just drive along in the middle of the road and they read off the data. They don't touch the sides, but that doesn't matter because they can easily read what's there in the middle. And what shingled magnetic recording does is packs the tracks closer together by using the write head to overwrite those surplus areas at the side of the tracks which the read heads don't normally hit. So this way the read heads can still read the parts of the tracks just like they used to, but the write heads can write the tracks closer together. So that means you can fit more data on the same disk. But of course here's where the shingled part of SMR comes in. If the write heads can only write comparatively thick tracks, it means that if the drive needs to rewrite an area of data on the disk, the thick write head can't only erase the small part of the tracks that the read heads can see. So because the tracks are wide and they overlap each other, if you want to rewrite one track, you end up erasing not only the track you wanted, but also part of the track that's alongside it. What that means is that if you want to make a change to a previously written track, you'd actually need to rewrite several whole tracks again, one over the other. And to do that, you'd first need to reread all the tracks before you write the new ones. Of course, all that takes time. That's why SMR drives are slow. And if you're making lots of writes to previously written data, SMR drives end up doing an enormous amount of rereading and rewriting, far more data than whatever you're actually changing. And that not only makes the drives slow, but it also makes them hot, neither of which are good things for hard drives. Now, knowing what we know now about SMR drives, you can imagine the kind of strain that a drive like that would be under after a few weeks of essentially random writes and rewrites in a Drobo. Again, Storage Review has some benchmarks of the SMR drives where they show how the drive's response time in these situations can go as high as 20 seconds or more. And if you think back to what we already know about Drobo's patience getting exhausted after it has had to look at its watch one time too many, that probably explains why we got our red light and why Drobo finally kicked the drive out of the array. Now, as it happens, I actually put the drive back into its USB shell and it tested and formatted just fine. So it looks like the more sedate life of a USB drive being used mostly for long-term storage is probably more what these drives are best at right now. And now we know, or at least now I know, everybody else probably knew all this already. This is probably something I should have thought about a lot sooner, but basically, in short, SMR drives are not a good choice for NAS arrays or Drobos. Yeah, lesson learned. The only thing to tag onto that maxim, I suppose, is that although we know that the 8TB Seagate drives use SMR, and that really should have been obvious, while Googling around about this, I was surprised that quite a number of articles mention SMR technology in relation to Seagate's 5TB drives as well. Now, apparently Seagate won't confirm or deny if they use the technology in those drives, so it could be nothing, but if they are, then I'm a bit surprised by that, because there doesn't seem to be anything about the 5TB drives that give any indication at all that they're anything other than a normal technology desktop drives. If SMR technology is in use, then that does suggest that they're not suitable for being driven too hard, and of course, being as it was both 5TB drives that failed in the Drobo first of all, at the start of all this mess, then that does make me wonder if that could have been something to do with it. You can take the view that sticking these drives in the Drobo was doomed to failure in the first place, and that the whole end-to-end experience has been a catalogue of fail. You have to admit it was a bit of an interesting ride, and from where I'm sitting that at least makes it pretty much worth the cost of admission. So, thanks for watching.